Welcome to Pasa, HSIs, a podcast dedicated to everything Hispanic serving institutions. I'm your host, Dr. Gina Ann Garcia, bringing you the news on what's happening in HSIs. Join us as we explore the history and evolution of HSIs, culturally relevant and liberatory practices, current and emerging research with HSIs, and the policies that shape servingness.
Saludos, HSI familia, and welcome back to ¿Qué pasa, HSIs? Today, we are talking to Dr. Leticia Villarreal Sosa, Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Development and Professor in the School of Social Work at University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, also known as UTRGV. She earned her BSW at University of Illinois and her graduate degrees at the University of Chicago. She is an experienced school social worker and licensed clinical social worker. Her research focuses on Latinx and immigrant youth, school social work, international social work, and school equity. She is well respected as a social work scholar and professor with many accolades, including the Best Conceptual Article published in 2021 in the International Journal of Social Work Education, the Davlin Diversity Leadership Award in 2022, and the Gary Lee Schaefer Award in 2023. She has worked at multiple HSIs, including Dominican University and UTRGV, where she is advancing servingness at the university, both in the classroom and in decision-making on campus. She currently serves on the University of Texas System HSI Task Force. As a personal connection, we co-authored an article on decolonizing faculty governance at HSIs, which we're going to talk about today. Doctora Leticia, mi amiga en la lucha, thank you for joining us on ¿Qué pasa, HSIs, where we talk about all things HSIs. We're going to jump right in and learn about you. So go ahead and start by just telling us about your servingness journey.
Hello, Gina. Good to see you and talk with you today. I was really excited about having this opportunity to share space together and talk about HSI, right? So my journey, my HSI journey, in some ways, when I was reflecting about it, I was thinking that it always has just been a part of who I am. So it's not something that I was necessarily conscious about, that I thought, oh, this is sort of servingness, or this is, it was just, it's what I embodied in many ways. And so I think back to my experience in undergrad. First gen, my parents were immigrant parents, also first one in my family, to go to college. I ended up at U of I, Urbana-Champaign, but I ended up there in 89 to 93. And in 1992, or when we had the Cinco de Mayo protests. And so, and this sort of intersects with my discipline as well in terms of social work, right? But with we were one of the first Latino students, first generation of Latino students on that campus. And of course, we didn't have a Latina studies program. We had no Latino faculty. We had, there was issues with retention, recruitment and retention of, Latinx students. And so, one thing, so there's several lessons there, right? But one was that a lot of that work was coalitional, right? So, and the women did a lot of that work behind the scenes. And so it was Black women, white anti-racist women, Latina women, and Asian women. We had this sort of collective, right? We used sort of the YWCA as our sort of gathering, right, of gathering these different sort of affinity groups, and through the women, then reaching out to the men and putting together this collective body of students, right? Because we weren't enough students on campus as Latinx students to actually be able to do this on our own and really have the impact that we had, right? And so, through a lot of this organizing and forming these coalitions with different groups on campus, progressive students on campus, we finally, had the Cinco de Mayo protest. It happened on Cinco de Mayo in 92, and we took over the administration building. And, and we, and our demands were that, right? Our demands were Latina studies program, Latina faculty, and recruitment and retention of students. And that was really powerful because one is, I think it also was a part of my feminist consciousness, right? In terms of really understanding the power that women and the role that women play in organizing, but also, just and the importance in this intersectional and this coalitional sort of organizing, and how important that was for that particular movement. And so that's sort of in a way where my servingness or servingness journey started, right? Because it really was about, really demanding, right, that the university see us, recognize us, and meet our needs. And subsequently, we did end up succeeding in getting a Latino Studies program at U of I. And years later, when I was already a faculty member at Dominican, I had a chance to go to see the first cohort of PhDs graduate from that program. I was in tears. I was like, I could not believe how beautiful this is, that here we struggled, and this story intersects with so many other things in so many ways too, right? Because currently I'm working on a book that's going to be published in July. It's an edited book of stories of Latinas, of Puerto Rican and Mexican women in Chicago who were activists in the 60s and 70s, and many still are, and they're in their 80s, and all of the women, actually, if they can be, are still very involved in a lot of work. And they really, and their focus for a lot of them was education, it was politics, health, those kinds of issues. But what intersected with that experience was that I happened to be interviewing one of the women. Like, I was taking these oral histories and I was interviewing Ada Lopez. And she starts telling me that she, because she was the first Latina elected to the statewide, to a statewide office in Illinois. And she starts telling me her story and why she decided to run for state office as a board of trustee for University of Illinois, because she heard about our protests and what was happening. And here she was behind the scenes, actually protecting us, right? Because the university were threatening, we had a lot to lose because they were threatening our scholarships. Some of the students had been arrested. So she worked behind the scenes to basically protect us. And I didn't even know that she had done that, or that was happening, until I'm sitting here, years later, hearing her story and her telling me this. And I just started to cry, because I just could not believe that here, that here I was in this space with this woman, gathering her oral history. And here we had intersected without even knowing, years ago. And so, yeah, so I think that is something that experience of organizing, of, coalition building, of feminist consciousness, of, intergenerational, work, sort of all of that is something that I carry into my work now.
Oh my gosh, I love the those themes, because, well,
Yeah.
interestingly, those themes keep coming up even this season 4. I can't, like, if sometimes I just string together the guests in a way that, like, we just have it's building on one another each episode, and like coalition building keeps coming up this season. But organizing also, that people serving this journey starts there, right? That, like, we organize and often as undergrads, that, like, that's where we learn how to do it, and that is serving us. Absolutely. I also know some of my doc students actually went through that program at UI, UC. So it's so cool to hear that you are part of it, to, like, bring about that change on campus. So thank you for sharing that beautiful story. Awesome. Well, let's talk a little bit more about your work. Well, a little bit, we're just getting into it, about your work on HSI, how you've actually done some work, particularly when you were at Dominican University. You were doing a lot of work with HSI, not specifically necessarily in, like, the director of HSI role, but you were doing a lot of HSI stuff on campus. So let's hear about that, some of the work you did at Dominican University around HSI.
Yeah, so at Dominican, that again, I think because it's just something that I, like, as I said before, like what I carry with me, right? It's just sort of part of my values and what I do. And so initially, when I started working at Dominican, there wasn't necessarily this consciousness about, oh, we're an HSI, or if there was, it was still very much this, it was something shameful. It was something bad. It was, there was still like the marketing material made an effort to make sure there were white students represented on those brochures. And there was a lot of concern about having too many, right, Latinx students. And so there wasn't a consciousness. And if there was, it was seen in a very negative way. And so I'm in the social work department there, and that's where my work really started, there within the social work department, because, and I think it's sort of part of the profession, but then definitely there in this program, where here we have, as a social work program, we were the most diverse program. We had the most, in terms of graduate programs, we were only a master's level program, but we had equal Latinx students and African-American Black students and white students, almost like in equal proportions. And then a very small percentage of, other students, MENA or Asian American, but mostly our students were Black, Latina, and white. So that was unique about our program. And so obviously the first thing that I wanted to do was to change the curriculum, because there was just nothing in the curriculum that reflected anti-racism, and social work is a profession that is supposed to be about social justice. It's supposed to be a human rights, internationally, social work is defined as a human rights profession. That's not always how we operate within the context of the United States. And that's another story, right, in terms of where my intellectual home is, in terms of Latin American social work, because that's grounded in a much more critical perspective of the history and what happened in Latin America compared to the United States, right? So a typical social worker in Latin America will know critical theories, will know all these things, not in the United States. So that's where I started, and that was such an uphill struggle. I wanted to add some courses that everyone needed to take that focused on, that centered race, right? So there was, I developed like 5 classes, one that focused on public policy and race, one that focused on empowerment practice with Latinos, Latinas, another one that was a human rights perspective, a human rights framework, and it was a study abroad, 2-week study abroad trip to Guatemala that focused on race, gender, and human rights as well. A course on feminist social work, but that centered women of color, right, in terms of how we understood feminism in an intersectional perspective. So this was really controversial, because I was centering race in every single class, right? This notion of race, racialization, all of these things. And so there was a lot of pushback. So that was my first sort of experience in really just experiencing, beginning to experience some of that harassment, right? Because I was threatening the status quo. I was threatening, what they wanted diversity to mean anything, right? Aging, just any of these categories, right? And I was like, yes, we have an intersectional perspective. We can talk about all that, but we're centering race because that's an organizing kind of category in our society, right? And how we understand things and how we live and how, and I remember that when I wrote the proposal for these courses, I actually wrote the proposal, and I had a colleague who was a white male, and I asked him to present the proposal, because I knew that if I presented the proposal, it would be dead, right? It wouldn't go anywhere. And so I had to give my proposal to him so that he could present it as if it was his proposal for these curriculum changes. And you'd think that once this was accepted, and I, developed these courses, and this was a course that would be required that everyone would have to take, one of those, right? They could elect them on those 4. But I continued. Every year it would resurface, and every year they would continue to try to water them down, or change the courses so that, and challenge kind of the notion of race being at the center, and talking about anti-racism. And so I really became, it was a struggle. It really was hard. And I think I always had to sort of think about, it was always weighing in my mind, right? Like, how important is this to me? And what does this mean in terms of whether I just decide in this case I'm going to be silent and not do anything, or I speak my truth, and I, and I propose these things, and I do these things that I know are going to get me in trouble. And so that was kind of the beginning of my journey there. And then I did go through a little bit of a phase, about 2 years, where I decided to try kind of that coping strategy of not speaking. And I was like, okay, you all don't want my opinion, okay. You're not going to get it. I'm not going to step in, because I would always the type of person that would step up to do all kinds of things, right? But that didn't last too long, because then I realized that what hurts me more, being silent and not speaking my truth and not advocating for things that I feel passionate about and I care about, or or just, or taking the risks, right? Taking the risks and doing the work anyway. And so I decided that it was taking the risks and doing the work anyway. And then later in my journey there at Dominican, once I was in that much more empowered state of, I'm just going to speak my truth regardless of what the reactions might be. I started to work on other kind of curriculum issues in terms of more of the general curriculum, and making sure that, because one thing about social work and the profession of social work is that it is very, race neutral, color, they try to be color blind. These interventions just work with anyone. They don't think about, and we don't read theorists. All the theorists in our practice class, for example, are all white, all white men, actually, in one of our practice classes. And so that's how the idea came about, to then try to kind of develop this particular course. And I know I'm getting ahead a little bit, but on critical consciousness, because we wanted to give students actual tools, not just learning the theory, right, and learning these theories, but actually how to kind of really engage in the skills to actually act, right, on this critical. So you have critical consciousness. Now what? Like, what do you do with it? And how do you do that work? And then the other thing was around developing a bilingual social work curriculum. And that was and that had been really important to me. And I kept saying, to the folks at Dominican, I was like, this is our student body, right? We have to, because I think that we took them for granted, because they were just their word of mouth, they didn't have to do a lot of recruiting. We're close to 2 communities that are, 80-90%, Latin. You have the cousins that went to Dominican, and then the, friends, whatever, right? So there's that established connection within the community. So we would get Latino students or Latinx students without really having to do a lot to get them. And so I think we just kind of took them for granted, and we didn't really do anything that really served them. And in social work, right, I knew that, in the Chicagoland area, right, there's other universities, other Catholic universities really looking to attract more Latinx students, right? And how did they do that? They did that by beginning to develop bilingual courses, or hiring, guess what, Latino faculty. Oh my gosh, what an idea. And they kept telling me, like, no, those aren't our competitors. I'm like, well, they're gonna be, right? Because when you look at the demographics, whether they care about our students or not, it could be a purely financial reason, but they know that they've got to make sure that they work hard to recruit our students, and they're going to make some changes. And that started happening, right? And still, I think at the time, I didn't really get support to develop those classes. At another institution in Chicago, I know the dean made that a priority and said, okay, this is a priority. Here's some resources, let's do this, right? At Dominican, it was just me trying to scrape together resources to do this, right? And that's where I did utilize a little bit of the HSI money, right, to pay for a consultant, because if I was going to do this, I wanted to do it right. And, bilingual teaching is not my area of expertise, but I wanted to learn from an expert. And so, I collaborated with someone who is a bilingual education expert, who could help me to kind of conceptually develop a dual language, social work course. And so, so that was just something that I think that I continued, to work on in terms of my department and social work, but also the other work that I did at Dominican, and it, in some ways connects back to just my intro, because I think when I think about leadership, right, I think a lot of my leadership at Dominican was very grassroots leadership, right? I wasn't, because at that institution, when you look at like who are the directors of all the HSI, minority serving grants, almost exclusively white folks, right? When we got our first particular grant, I actually did not want to I didn't want to lead the grant at the time, because being Latina, I knew that that would be a disaster. Like the campus was not ready for that at all. But I did do a lot of work again at the Grassroots, right, with other faculty. At one point when I was there, we did have a critical mass of faculty of color that really worked together to put pressure on the institution to get our first CBO position, and those kinds of things. So I think we accomplished a lot. And then in parallel, there were a lot of student protests and some of those things going on as well. And unfortunately, I don't think, there's always backlash. There's always kind of backwards and forwards, right? You sort of move forward in these ways, and then all of a sudden there's a reaction to that. And then we also then lost a lot of really talented Latin faculty who were a part of that, right? I was one of the only folks that stayed behind and lasted there a little longer. But I think that also just really taught me a lot about what leadership is, and that it can be, right, being an administrator and being in one of these, positions, but leadership can happen in a lot of different ways on campus, in these other sort of grassroots or more informal ways, and really affect change in these ways as well.
Absolutely, which that I talk about in my book, right? And transforming HSIs is like the grassroots leaders. And that's in the book because I see it so often that's actually where a lot of the HSI movement is happening. Like you said, like I'm faculty, I'm working with, pushing against the grain with other faculty. And I just want to like emphasize that like everything you were telling us about that was pushback on you changing the curriculum so it would be more centered on Latina students was with the backdrop of HSI, right? Like that the campus had embraced its HSI identity in many ways and had gotten grants. Yet faculty are still struggling to do servingness where they are supposed to do it, which is in the classroom, right? Which is ironic. It's the irony of this work. That it can't just be the grant. We can't just get the grant and say, hey, look, we have a grant. That means we're amazing. Hey, look, we got a seal of excellencia. That means we're amazing. But then over here in social work, the faculty can't actually do servingness right in the classroom like that. It's interesting, right? That's this HSI work. And I just wanted to highlight that and emphasize that within your story because I know, right? So thank you for that. So with that social justice curriculum, I know I heard you speaking about some of the outcomes, the liberatory outcomes. Did y'all measure, like once you were able to implement it, that like try to assess what students were getting out of this more critical curriculum?
Yeah, we actually did implement a critical consciousness scale. And I think, and that was really great to sort of just see that very tangible change, right, in terms of students, looking at sort of where they were pre the curriculum and then how they understood themselves, right, as global citizens, as actors, right, in this world on all these different issues. The other piece of that, I think that was important in terms of the way that curriculum was designed. And I am a big curriculum person, so you can see this, right, in terms of the important work that has to be done at all different levels at HSIs. But because the other part of it was really changing the curriculum as well, so that we had what's called like a motivational framework, right, in terms of how you engage the students in different activities. So for example, and the course did also focus on leadership. And so there was one assignment where we asked them to sort of do this interview. So they read an article that focused on somebody, this person who did interviews with leaders and talked specifically about their positionality and how that shaped their leadership experience. And so then, you know, we would have students kind of read that article and look at the methodology. I contacted the author of that article, asked if we could use the same interview and then maybe adapt it. They were very happy to share, right? And be a part of this process of then having students do this and interview somebody themselves, but then also consider those questions on themselves and their own positionality and how that shapes kind of how they understand themselves. As leaders as well, right? And then having opportunities throughout that assignment to pair together and share, you know, read each other's work, have these conversations. So that was the other piece of this curriculum, right? So we are kind of addressing this notion of critical consciousness, thinking very intentionally about what kinds of, you know, material might be in there. And then but then also thinking about like, how do we teach it and what kinds of strategies do we use that really are meaningful for students that they could relate to, that they can connect with, and understand that they're reading this article, but then they also kind of do a similar and then do an interview with somebody themselves using the same sort of model of that author, but then also reflect on those same questions themselves, right, as potential leaders. So I think, and I guess, you know, my point with that is that it's not, it's all together, right? It's a holistic process of thinking very intentionally about who's represented in that curriculum and how are you doing that, but then also what is the curriculum, what is, you know, what does the teaching look like, what do the activities look like, and are we really mirroring who our students are in how we're going about, you know, with the learning process, right, as well. I think, you know, in terms of where we probably, you know, needed to continue to do more work is more opportunities for students, find more opportunities for students to actually maybe act on some of these some of this sort of sense of critical consciousness, kind of new consciousness, empowerment, sense of empowerment, and then and how might we facilitate more opportunities for them to actually, you know, go out into the world and do that work in different ways. One way I think that, you know, because my study abroad class to Guatemala, I do study abroad very differently than most other folks, because for me, a lot of study abroad can actually hurt communities, right? And also reinforce stereotypes and not be something that that is a liberatory experience for students, that sometimes it's just more of the colonial kind of mentality, especially in social work. We go and we help people and we volunteer at the orphanage, and isn't this great? I feel so good about myself. And just kind of an example, right, of how this happens for students. And so in this course, we do go abroad, and then but it's all done in collaboration with the people in Guatemala, right? And we visit an indigenous community that where a lot of trust had to be developed for that to happen, and a lot of transparency about what we can do, what we can't do, and what are our goals and what are their goals, and how do we share this experience together, and how can we address those power dynamics. And the message for students was not about going and helping, right? Because many of those communities were engaged in their own struggles for human rights, whether it's organizing against open pit mining, or the deforestation, or the palm, you know, the palm oil, you know, or the, you know, the hydroelectric dams in their communities, right? So these were communities that were already organizing, already doing work. They don't need us. The message for students was, how do you take this back then to your community, right? It's not about helping in Guatemala. It's what's your responsibility as an American citizen, understanding what our country is, you know, what the US, right? What their role is in these, in what's happening in the current state in Guatemala, right? Foreign policy, what does that look like? So what's our responsibility to our own government? but also then it was really beautiful because then students would, for example, then become involved in immigration rights here in the US, or Black Lives Matter, or, you know, these other kind of social movements, because they would make these beautiful connections between their own lived experience in the United States and what was happening in Guatemala with the different communities. So they could kind of, you know, build these connections and the learning. Because what was unique about us, because we were in HSI, is that most of our students that attended these types of trips were Latin or Black students, right? And so anyway, but just kind of an example of how all of this kind of just really fits together in thinking about very intentionally, right, about all these different pieces of how you design curriculum so that you, you know, so that it does reflect, right, the notion of servingness that you
Yes.
talk about.
Yes. Oh, I'm over here like
Not just
agree,
that notion.
retweet, all that. I mean that, yes. And even when you said that, like, you, the one piece where you felt like you didn't give students enough opportunity to do, right?
Yeah,
I hit that struggle as a professor as
yeah,
well. Like, making people conscious of the world isn't, you can't stop there. Like, my students, when I
right.
did that as a very first year
Yeah,
as an assistant professor, they're like, oh my God, right? Like,
yeah,
they're like, okay, racism is real, but now what, right? Like, you feel disempowered when you're like, now I'm
yeah,
very conscious of the things, but you haven't given me the tools to do anything about it.
yeah.
And so that's such an important piece of this critical consciousness and social justice curriculum, is like, okay, yeah, we're going to raise consciousness, but we better allow students to now take that information and do something productive with it. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing about social work, and it would be similar in other professions, right, where you serve communities, is that it's about both. It's about preparing the types of social workers that then are going to go out into communities and serve mostly communities of color, right? So what kind of folks do you want to, you know, have out there doing that work, and how do you want to prepare them, but also for their own experience as students, right, and their own and that's where I think, like, the bilingual class was just so beautiful, because I incorporated you know, like, we have some limits, right, because we have the accrediting body that says that you have to have certain things, and certain things have to match other courses and all this kind of stuff. But within the flexibility and freedom that I had, I added a lot of content that was culturally relevant content, you know, and the students, it was amazing. You know, one of the students was like, you know, just talked about how much she loved the readings, right? Because it was the first time that she felt like she could relate to some of the work that, you know, to what they were reading. And one of the phrases that just stays in my head with one of the students is that she, you know, she said, no me sentía que tenía pelos en la lengua, right? So in a different context, often students feel like they can't, they, you know, the imposter, you know, and they're, and I wish, I'm not, what's a better way to say that, right? Not necessarily imposter syndrome, because there's a way to reframe that, but just that feeling like I don't belong here, or I can't speak up here because I'm not as smart, or I can't, you know, and or just feeling inhibited in some way, right? And to, like, have a space where they felt that freedom to just, you know, to be able to express themselves in whatever language that they were comfortable speaking, because it was a dual language methodology, so they could speak in both, in one, you know. That's really powerful, right? That, you know, to hold space in that way for students, and that be a learning, it's a learning process, but it does so much more for students than just, you know, what they're learning in terms of the content.
Yes. So are you able to do some of this type of work now in your new role? Obviously, you're in your first year at
Yes,
UTRGV. So, you know, I'm in
yes.
my first year too, so I know, right? You at UC Berkeley, you kind of have to get the lay of the land first. But
Yep.
are you able to do some, because they're also an HSIs, and you're, you know.
Yes. Well, that's been a really interesting journey, because so one thing that I didn't mention is that in terms of formal roles, right, at Dominican, I was on the HSI task force there. Now in my role here at UTRGV, I'm on the Texas system-wide HSI task force. So once a month, I meet with all the folks in the Texas system. There's two representatives from each of the schools, you know, to have these conversations about, you know, HSI. And recently I was saying to someone that, I'm having a really hard time like figuring out what's going on campus in terms of the notion of like servingness and HSI work. Like I'm really struggling. I can't figure it out. And the person said to me, well, you can't figure it out because it's not really happening, right? And in a critically conscious way. And I think it's such a different dynamic than Dominican, right? So for me personally, as a faculty member, I'm going from a setting where I'm the only, right? One of the last standing Latinas who stayed at Dominican for as long as I did, right? Because so many people left until I finally was like, yeah, basta, no more, I'm done. And I moved on to a place where I could really grow in a different way. But so then all of a sudden I'm in this space where, administrators are Latinas, Latinos. I'm in an administrative role. I'm amongst other Latina faculty. It's a diverse faculty, but there's a large representation, right? It's right on the border. It's the Valley of Latina faculty. All of our students, like most of our students, 90% right, are Latin students. We have students that cross the border every day to come to school, to come to the university. It's an interesting space. And so I think part of what I'm trying to do is really develop a little bit of the consciousness, at least on my campus, about servingness, because I think people just look at the designation of, oh, well, we're this percent, we've always been, we're like, so then it's like a taken for granted, right? And no interrogation or little interrogation of what that means. And so it's like, we've got the students, so we're done, right? We're done. And at least in my little world, in my department, I've been treading really lightly, because I need to really learn more, right, about where people are at, assess, and then begin to bring in opportunities for conversations. And so I had actually Marcia, her, I had her come and speak to the faculty and just to lead a conversation on what is servingness. And people received that really well. And then I shared with you that that I also, when we did in January, we did an academic affairs retreat. And right now I'm serving in two roles. So I'm the Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Development. And I'm also on a temporary basis, the Acting Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. And so I was kind of, leading this retreat with the Dean. And I brought in, again, some of your work, right, on exploring like, what does servingness mean, and again, just having a conversation about this, because where I want to go with it is to begin to then interrogate, start with the curriculum, right? Here we are, like we supposedly have a Latino specialization, like Latinos and families, like specialization. But again, when you look at the curriculum, do they use Celia Felikov's book? I don't think so, right? Like we really have to audit our own curriculum and really kind of look at how do we understand, and even understanding, how do we understand our students, right? And their lived experiences, because there are some differences too between, the faculty that grew up in the Valley, several generations in the Valley versus some of our students that maybe are, maybe second-gen immigrants, right, from Mexico. There's a lot of learning. And I think that's the other piece of this that is a lesson from Dominican in terms of the work with Latinx students is, like, for example, at Dominican, one of the classes I developed was, empowerment practice with Latinos, right? This course on serving Latina families. And a lot of times students would say, oh, well, I don't need to take that course because I'm Latina, right? So I know how to work with Latino families. And then they'd get into my course and they were just blown away, right? Because we talked about, like, I started the course with Juan Gonzalez's Harvest of Empire, where we look at all the different countries and, and what US intervention has meant in terms of immigration and to the US and, the current state in those countries now. And, so to begin to connect all these things, but also just appreciate themselves, the incredible similarities and diversities, right, within the Latino community. So I think really exploring that piece too. So I'm really hoping so there's two sides to it, right? One is the two parts. One is within my own department as now a formal leader, right? How do I, in my leadership role, because I think this is the other thing that's important about leadership, is that often we relegate these roles. And in my case, I've never had like a CDO or like a role that's specific about diversity or equity or HSI, but I embed this work in that role. And I think it needs to be that way, right? We can't like leave it in this, only this person does that work, right? Like we all need to take responsibility in our roles for this work. And so I think in that way, it's been really important for me to kind of leave that legacy of this role. If I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, then that means that this role has to care about equity and has to care about servingness. And that's part of my job, and let's write that into the job description, not just the person who focuses on, equity or, whatever that, the other roles are. And so within my department, I think I'm sort of beginning to, and I'm at that stage now. But at first it was very gentle, and a lot of learning, right, too, from people to understand their stories. And now I think, and people are ready, right, because we've been having these conversations little by little, to maybe engage in them more deeply and to begin to kind of unpack our curriculum, right? That we may have 98% Latinx students, but 98% of the authors we read, right, are predominantly white males in social work. Then there's the campus-wide stuff, right? That I'm still figuring out. And I'm really excited about being on this task force, but I think I'm still looking for ways to connect with different groups or bodies or people on campus where we can begin to make some connections in terms of what this work means on our campus and what are you doing and what are you doing and how can this. So one of the things that I am leading is this Equitable Student Pathways project. So we got a little bit of funding to do this, and then bringing in several faculty members to work on the bachelor's level social work curriculum. And they'll, and because we have a little bit of funding, we'll be able to pay people to participate in these regular meetings. And I've made servingness center to how we're going to go about the curriculum redesign and development. So, it's complex.
Slowly.
It's really unpacking a lot, right?
Yes, slowly, poco a poco, just a little bit at a time,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Okay, thank you for going down that path. And I think the comparison, right? Because that's the reality is like people leave one HSI and they go to another one, and they all operate very differently, right? Even one down the street can operate very differently, right? And so to think that we do our work differently in different spaces, but sounds like your grassroots leadership is going to continue at UTRGV and going to do amazing stuff and centering servingness. Which is awesome, right? Like that, I know they're going to really benefit from all the stuff that you've done already and that are going to continue to do. So one thing with our grassroots leaders, since we've been talking about that, I want to continue to go down that theme, is like they tend to get tired. I see that all happening a lot at HSIs, that people who are fighting against an entire system but don't have the support of the system get tired. And you talked about this. You talked about people leaving, right? You haven't specifically said why, but people leaving, they leave. And it could be because they're tired. It could be because they've got a better job. Who knows what? But part of it is we're not retaining people of color at HSIs, and that's a problem. And it's not, we're not talking about it enough. So I wanted to engage in conversation with you about that, because I think you agree, right? Like that the retention issue is big, and that it is this fight that we're doing at HSI. So what are your thoughts on that? It's like the tensions between, yay, we're an HSI, yet the people who are doing HSI work, you can't seem to retain them.
Yeah. And I think, some of that goes back to, at least, I can speak to my experience at Dominican, right? But the tension between, again, we're an HSI, but like, and some of these folks that have left, right, are the people who are really trying to bring about some of those changes that sometimes were very threatening to people. Um, and and I think in some of those situations, I think there were opportunities for retaining people. But there's a choice not, active choice not to. And then at other times, I think it's really like at some point people have to make their own choice, right? About what there's one of my beautiful, wonderful sister friends, who was one of my supports there at Dominican, Lily. She left, and we both had this tension that we always talked about, right? Her choice to leave and my choice to stay, and really trying to kind of so even that, right, with respecting, we were going through almost parallel situations, and and we both kind of made different choices, and really respecting each other in those choices that we were making, right? But I mean, so there's that individual level of how are we navigating that, but really I think it is such a system issue, right? Because even little things that could be changed that are not changed. So for example, something very simple that could have been done at Dominican is that several of us as women of color, we asked for funding to go to the Women of Color conference, right? Because you need those spaces for re-energizing, for hope, for love, for connecting with other women of color, for having these conversations that affirm you, and and all of this, right? And it wasn't an expensive conference, because this Women of Color conference, they usually keep the cost really reasonable. Housing is reasonable, right? Like the registration, all that, right? It wasn't a lot of money. We had a provost that was a Black woman at one time, and she understood that and gave us funding to go. Then other provosts came in, and they didn't get that. They didn't get that. They're like, well, you can use your own professional development money for that. Well, if you only get 1,200 once or twice, and you need to go to your discipline specific conferences, like you're paying a cost, right? Like you're not getting to go to your, like it's like those simple things, right? To not have to fight for such basic resources that give you those. If you're not getting, like, if you don't have that critical mass of faculty on your campus, and you don't have that, then you need to support people to find that community, right? And find where they can feel that, because a lot of times, even when we go to our discipline specific conferences, I'm in social work, right? I go to SWIR, which is the really elite, social work conference. It's a very exclusive space. It's not an inclusive space. And I'm always so aware and conscious of being a woman of color in that space, and understanding the importance of showing up in those spaces. But you're also then doing all that psychological work, right? Being in those spaces that are not inclusive. And so you really need those spaces. And so I think there's just, a lot of, and I think, and it's interesting too, because I think my experience was also one of, in some ways, I getting promoted, getting into this administrative position, but not really having real power, not having, any a budget, not having, so it was, I was very much a symbolic, uh, a person in that role, in a very symbolic way, right? To say like, oh, look how great we are. As an HSI, we have a Latina in this role. But so I think, so for me, like, I really see it as a systemic issue, right? Like, what are those system things that need to be in place to value people, to support people, so that you can, right? Because it was such a different campus when there was a critical mass of people, to all of a sudden not having that anymore. And I think for me, maybe I was able to live through it as long as I did, because I mean, it wasn't my first job out of, my PhD program, right? I already had dealt with some pretty I dealt with the public school system, I had worked in the public school system. So when you work in those settings, right, you develop a really thick skin in many ways, right, and go through a lot of very similar types of things. So in some ways, I think psychologically, I was just a little more, I was prepared in some ways to kind of navigate some of those things. I was ready because I had a little bit of a rest because I had been in I had worked, so before I was in academia, I was a school social worker. So I'd worked in a district that was predominantly white. And I worked in a school that was very hostile even towards faculty of color. I was the first Latina faculty to be hired there. And only because it was very well known informally that they didn't hire minorities, right? And the only reason that I was hired is because I was hired by the school in the district that did hire minorities. I had gotten tenure, and then I was able to transfer to the other school. So that was just that was my first, out of my master's program kind of job. But then I went to Chicago Public Schools, which was an amazing experience, right? A lot of people think like, oh, Chicago Public Schools, it's, but for me, I loved it because it was, one is that a lot of white folks who worked there were some of the folks that were very committed, right, to the students that they were serving. Whereas in the suburban schools I worked in, a lot of white folks were like, I don't want those. I didn't sign up for this. I'm working out here because I didn't want those kids in my classroom, right? And that kind of thing. And in Chicago Public Schools, there was a critical mass of faculty of color. So it was one of my first professional experiences of, of being acknowledged for my skills and what I brought to the position versus having to navigate first my racial identity in that space. So, so I think, but I guess that just goes back to my point about how do we structure systems of support for people, right? What do people need in these spaces so that they feel connected, they feel supported, and they feel valued? And especially when they're going to be engaging in this work that some people are going to feel like is too threatening, right? So somebody has to have your back.
Yes. Oh my gosh. You have me thinking about so many things. Like, I'm like, okay, we
Yeah.
need to like there needs to be, we need to specifically train our, because this is, I see it and hear it over and over again of the people doing HSI work are just overworked, overpressured, not enough support, tired, all this sort of stuff. Now there's two things I'm always mapping on like frameworks, and I don't know the framework. It might be a social work framework, but one thing you said was you can go into survival mode, right? When you're dealing with these systems of oppression. You said that earlier, right? That you went into survival mode, which was like, I'm going to be quiet. I'm not going to say anything, right? That's not resistance. That's survival, right? That was for your own protection versus resistance, right? Like, we need to go to this conference. We need to get tools. We need to refresh. We need to be loved. We need to be cared for by women so that we can go back in and do the work. So I wanted to point that out. I don't know if there are other strategies, right, when dealing with this that you can draw on your own work, but I think that's important for us to understand because people have to draw on different strategies, right, for dealing with these types of things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think one of the things that did sort of get me through a lot of those moments too, to sort of stay in the space of resistance, is, and that's advice that I would give to other people when they come, right, is to connect with people outside of your department, connect, like, you have to be so. But if universities, right, some of these spaces could do more with, like, again, just facilitating some of those connections in some way, right? Because you really have to, again, do more psychological work and more work on your own to be intentional about finding these connections in other spaces so that you have these people in other spaces, right? And sometimes I think for me, even if somebody, Lily, who was in the Spanish department, or somebody else who was in sociology, right? But just knowing that they were there, even if we didn't always connect, that was enough for me. Just knowing they were there, and that if I really needed to, I could reach out. But there's so many things that, and I think, and I guess, some of it goes again back to the formal leadership, right? The people who are in positions of power to make some of these decisions, make decisions about how resources are used, how you're going to support faculty of color, and how you're going to show them that they are valued on campus. We've lost a lot of people that we didn't have to lose,
Yes. Leaders who are listening, please note, like, yes, this is such an important conversation because we ask people to do this really hard work of trying to change an entire organization and don't support them. Like, we can't just leave people to like be on their own, right? And trying to survive on their own within systems of oppression, especially women of color. And I say it all the time, HSI work is often women of color. It's often Latinas leading a lot of this work. It's women of color really pushing for this and really pushing for servingness. So one more thing I wanted to talk about, since me and you co-authored an article about decolonizing faculty governance. And, you know, not everybody gets a chance to read articles, but I wanted to just bring that in and have a conversation about that, because people, when I say it, people get excited. They're like, what? Decolonizing faculty governance? So talk to us about that, because you work through these decolonial theoretical frameworks in your own work, and we did that work together. On this idea of we have to address faculty governance structure. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this article really came about because of just our lived experiences in the institution, right? In terms of having a faculty governance that did not really represent, right, the needs of or voices of or perspectives of a Latin faculty, right? And so I mean, I think in some ways this also intersected with the notion of, you know, relationships, right? That we're a relationship-centered institution, but then who has access to those relationships? And then what happens in those spaces when, you know, the very people that are really wanting to, again, like, you know, to sort of maintain, right, the current status quo and not be the folks who are willing to kind of question or disrupt kind of some of how we do things. And I mean disrupt in a good way, right? You know, when those are the people that are in these positions of power, right? So even something like curriculum decisions, right? And often also because, you know, you're not necessarily centering, again, servingness, centering the needs of students, you're centering the needs of the faculty in those roles, who again are sort of sometimes, you know, voting or, you know, taking on issues in their own interest, right? So who is represented on faculty governance is really critical, because so many important things go through faculty governance, right? You're talking about, as we've spent all this time talking about curriculum, right? You know, faculty vote, you know, it has to go through faculty governance first, right? If you're going to make some sort of major curriculum change, and then you know, and then they vet it and all this kind of stuff, and then it goes to the rest of the faculty in certain things, right? So I think, you know, it was such a, but you also have the challenge of then, if you don't have a lot of faculty of color as well, you know, then you're overburdening them as well, right? So it's like this, you know, but I think, you know, and then we had a particular kind of just issue on our campus with, again, one of these decisions that was made that was not in the best interest of students. It was about protecting, you know, minors that, you know, that students were not necessarily interested anymore, that, you know, or majors or minors that didn't, or maybe that could have been interesting to students if they had thought about how they might revamp their curriculums to make it relevant to our students. And so you see that kind of stuff just playing out within faculty governance, but then other things too, like tenure and promotion, who's on those committees, you know, and those kinds of things. So I think, and I bring up sort of this being based on our own lived experience as well, just because, you know, this article is written from this sort of methodological framework of testimonio, right? And so that alone in some ways is really disrupting like the coloniality of power in many ways, right? Because we're really centering and honoring our lived experiences in this academic way. And I was having a conversation with Lily, my friend, I keep mentioning Lily, about this because it was interesting to me that we were talking about how, you know, because obviously this, you know, this article had there was a lot of reaction to it, as you said, on campus, right? It was very, you know, the white fragility, it almost proved our points that we were making in there, right? In terms of the response to the article. But she also writes very, very similar things, but from a from a literature, like a fiction essay, right, from writing in that way, not in this sort of formal peer-reviewed academic article. And so she was noting that in those ways, if she tells her story in that way, in this creative way, it was like okay, because it wasn't as threatening, because it was her story, and it doesn't have to have any meaning for them beyond that, right? Whereas in this case, it was very threatening, because we're almost even disrupting some of these notions of this, they couldn't accept that this article that was written from this methodology, using testimonio, using lived experience, that was an easy way for them to devalue the work, right, and invalidate the work. But because it was so threatening, because it was, very well, research written, peer-reviewed, all these things. And so it was scary for them to actually see something in that format or in that way, right? So it's interesting to me, right, that I think the difference, but so we're talking about the difference, right, between her telling a very similar story, but in this sort of creative writing way, and people could distance themselves from it, and it was okay, but not tell the story in this way, and this was very threatening to folks.
Yes, because it was our storytelling, but we were speaking about the power structures, the colonial structures that then
exactly.
then the colonial structures came for us.
Exactly.
Which was the irony of it all. We're like, whoa.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So,
Because, because of, I was going to say, because of course, if you're going to really, because we were asking, right, that you have to disrupt kind of, the power dynamics here, and think about how we, these different hierarchies that we have within academia, and who gets to have a voice or not. And if you're going to really be inclusive, then those things, even something as simple as like, the how we use Robert's rules, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how those same things can be used in some ways to, again, like maintain, power structures and all those kinds of things, right? Without and the challenges with even being able to think about a different way of being or doing or sharing power.
Yes. I think the other important thing to know about this was that we really highlighted that the HSI work, even the HSI director, is disconnected from those power structures, right? And even for us, we noted that the VP of DEI is disconnected from those power structures.
Exactly.
So the people who are trying to do better by our students, who are doing diversity, equity, inclusion work, who are doing HSI work, who are doing servingness, who are transforming their curriculum because they're grassroots leaders, can't get past the formal faculty structures. And we know those structures have a lot of power on all campuses. Academic Senate or faculty governance, whatever you're going to call it. They can shut all the stuff you're doing down, which means HSI and DEI and social justice stay periphery on the periphery.
Exactly. Right? And you mentioned, the DEIJ and also the HSI leaders, right? But also staff, right? Like who does the majority of that day-to-day work with students? Who interfaces with students in that way? It's staff, right? And so, again, right, it's like thinking about how disconnected or how staff in many ways, because of these different dynamics of power, play out, and the way that staff have so much wisdom to share with faculty around decisions that we make that affect students, but there isn't necessarily a mechanism for their voices to be heard within that process either.
Yes. Oh, I love to see you just thriving, knowing that you've been through a lot and that you've had to resist a lot, the systemic powers that be in higher education, and you continue to thrive. And so I just want to say that because I know a lot of your work and all the beautiful things you're doing. And we'll share in the show notes some of your, your articles and some of your work, because you are doing really phenomenal work. So thank you for coming to the show. Thank you for talking about social work and HSI and servingness, all this sort of stuff, and being a grassroots leader and really showing us what that looks like. But before you get out of the pod, you have to answer the final question. So the show is called ¿Qué pasa HSIs? So how do you respond to that? ¿Qué pasa HSIs?
¿Qué pasa HSIs? ¿Qué pasa HSIs is I think well, the first thing that pops into my mind is just the beauty of our students, right? Their resilience and their cultural strengths and the joy, right, in doing this work collectively, you know, and yeah, and I think that's what I sort of keep coming back to in a lot of this work, right? Is because part of servingness and HSI work, right, is really understanding our students from this strengths perspective and honoring, right, their cultural knowledge and who they are in this process, and making sure that the systems and the structures we create really honor that. And honor us as faculty too, right, who are doing this work. But la lucha, right? It's as the wise women. Actually, I'll end with this, right? The wise women that I interviewed for this book. I was recently going back and doing the copy edits, and I realized that two of them I had mentioned unfinished business, right? This is unfinished business. So it's our work and our job to continue, right? The legacy of those who came before us, and to continue this for those who come after us.
Yes, I love it. I love ending with that. Thank you for being here with us today on Que Pasa HSIs.
Thank you, Gina.